Midnight, the cruel case of incest of the Yukon in the U.S. Forced to be the wife of the father and the brothers. This is a story you may never have heard, but one that profoundly marked the judicial and medical history of the United States in the 1970s. In the depths of the Appalachian Mountains, where the dense green of the trees hides secrets as old as the rocks themselves, the Blackwood family lived. 025, to the rare visitors of the small community of Pine Hollow in Western Virginia, the family seemed only reserved and traditional. But a dark reality was hidden behind the wooden walls of that isolated cabin, a reality that would only come to light in 1978 when Margaret Blackwood, then 23, finally managed to escape the nightmare that was her own home. 047, the patriarch, Joseph Blackwood, born in 1931, was known in the region as a withdrawn man of few words. After his wife Ellen died during the birth of their fifth son in 1962, Joseph gradually severed the family from any contact with the outside world. Located more than 20 kilometers from the nearest town, the Blackwood property became practically inaccessible when Joseph began blocking the access roads with fallen trees and makeshift fences. 115, at that time, it was common for families to live in isolation in the mountains, following old traditions and distrusting strangers, explains local historian Robert Jenkins. But the Blackwood case surpassed all boundaries of what could be considered a simple reclusive lifestyle. On the property lived Joseph, his three sons, Thomas, born in 1952, William, 1954, and James, 1958, and his two daughters, Margaret, born in 1955, and the youngest, Sarah, from 1962. 149, the oldest daughter, Elizabeth, had died as a child from pneumonia without ever receiving proper medical treatment. The isolation was almost total. The boys occasionally went to town to sell wood or trade animals for supplies, but the girls were never seen. The children did not attend school, which, although uncommon, was not illegal at the time since Virginia's home education laws were quite flexible. 213, what no one knew was that since the age of 13, Margaret had been forced by her father to assume the role of the family's wife. The horror began a few months after her mother's death, when Joseph declared that Margaret would now be the woman of the house. The Blackwood case is particularly disturbing because it represents an extreme form of social isolation combined with forced consanguineous practices, explains forensic psychology expert Dr. Helena Rodriguez. 239, Joseph's absolute control over his children created a microcosm where his distorted rules became the only reality they knew. At 16, Margaret gave birth to her first child, a girl with serious congenital deformities who lived only 3 days. No one outside the family knew of this birth, and the child was buried in a small makeshift cemetery at the back of the property. 309, between 1971 and 1978, Margaret would give birth to 5 more children. 2 of them survived, Robert, born in 1973, and Mary, born in 1975. Both exhibited visible signs of genetic problems, including webbed fingers, compromised cognitive development, and, in Robert's case, severe facial malformation. The genetic consequences of consanguinity are well documented, explains Dr. Thomas Marshall, a geneticist at the University of Virginia. 335, when close relatives have children, the risk of rare recessive diseases and congenital malformations increases dramatically. In the case of the Blackwood family, with multiple generations of consanguineous relationships, the genetic problems were amplified to catastrophic levels. 356, the situation worsened further when Sarah, the younger sister, began to show signs of puberty. Fearing the same fate, Margaret made the decision that would forever change the course of this story, to escape and seek help. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. These real stories of consanguinity reveal a dark side of society that few have the courage to confront, but we all need to know to protect the most vulnerable. 426, subscribe to continue your journey through these hidden truths that shape our understanding of the human condition. The night of October 17, 1978, was exceptionally cold when Margaret Blackwood, carrying her 2 young children, took advantage of everyone being asleep to flee the property. The escape had been meticulously planned for months. 445, Margaret had kept small amounts of money that she occasionally received from her brothers, gathered some clothes, and, most importantly, memorized the route to the main road. I remember that night as if it were yesterday, retired Sheriff Clyde Donovan would reveal years later. He was on duty when a disheveled woman with two clearly disabled children knocked on the door of the Pine Ridge police station at 4:30 a.m. She could barely speak. 5:12, she was in a state of shock, malnourished, and showed obvious signs of prolonged abuse. Margaret's initial account was so disturbing that Sheriff Donovan initially suspected he might be dealing with someone with mental problems, but the consistency of the details and the presence of children with obvious signs of genetic problems convinced him to investigate. 5:35, the children barely spoke, recalls nurse Janet Williams, who attended the family at the local hospital. The boy, Robert, had what would later be diagnosed as syndactyly webbed fingers and jaw problems that made eating difficult. The girl, Mary, had severe strabismus and showed clear signs of developmental delay. The revelation of Margaret's story triggered one of the largest police operations in the county's history. 6:01, the next morning, a team of police officers accompanied by social workers went to the Blackwood property. What they found confirmed the nightmare Margaret had reported. The cabin, built by Joseph's grandfather decades earlier, was in deplorable condition. There was no electricity or running water. The interior revealed a primitive standard of living, with makeshift divisions creating rooms separated only by torn curtains. 6:27, at the back of the property, officers found the small cemetery where Margaret's other children, who did not survive, were buried. Joseph and his 3 adult sons were arrested immediately. Sarah, then 16, was placed in state custody. Later medical examinations would reveal that she had also been a victim, being 2 months pregnant. 6:48, the Blackwood case exposed a reality that many preferred to believe no longer existed in modern America, explained social historian Elizabeth Parker. Isolated communities in the Appalachian Mountains maintained 19th-century traditions and practices well into the 20th century. Some of these included marriages between cousins, and in extreme cases like this one, relationships between parents and children or siblings. 7:13, the local press initially handled the story with discretion, but when details began to leak, the case gained national prominence. Journalists from major media outlets converged on the small town, shocking local residents who had mostly been unaware of the Blackwood family's existence. "We never imagined something like this could happen so close," Pine Ridge Mayor Harold Johnson said at the time. 7:36, those mountains hide many families that live on the fringes of society. But this is something we thought was possible only in medieval times. Medical examinations performed on Margaret, her children, and her sister Sarah revealed the devastating impact of years of consanguinity. In addition to visible malformations, the children had cardiac, immunological, and neurological problems. 8:01, Sarah, although only 16, already showed signs of early osteoporosis and kidney problems. Prolonged consanguinity has cumulative effects across generations, explains Dr. Marshall. Each successive generation of consanguineous unions increases the load of harmful genetic mutations, leading to a gradual collapse of physical and mental health. 8:24, during the investigation, it was discovered that Joseph's own mother, Eliza Blackwood, was his first cousin. This pattern of cousin marriages had been common in the family for at least 4 generations, creating a compromised genetic pool even before the most recent events. The case began to reveal not only a family tragedy but a broader social problem rooted in the geographical and cultural isolation of Appalachia's rural communities. 8:53, the trial of Joseph Blackwood and his 3 sons began in April 1979, attracting unprecedented national attention to the small county courthouse. The prosecutor assigned to the case, Catherine Reynolds, a young lawyer determined to see justice done, faced significant challenges. There were no clear precedents for a case of such nature and magnitude, explains legal historian Paul Withers. 9:18, most incest cases that reached the courts involved a single perpetrator and victim, not an entire family system built around this practice. The 4 men were charged with multiple crimes, including kidnapping, false imprisonment, and what was at the time classified as immoral relations within the family. Virginia's legislation had not yet modernized its legal language to deal with cases of forced incest. 9:44, Margaret's testimony, which lasted 3 days, was considered by those present to be one of the most disturbing moments in American judicial history. Speaking in a low, almost inaudible voice, she described how, at the age of 13, her father announced that she would replace her deceased mother in all respects. "My father said that was how things had always been done in the mountains, that it was our family's tradition," Margaret stated. 1009, he said the family's blood needed to be kept pure, that we couldn't trust outsiders. When Margaret tried to resist for the first time at age 15, Joseph locked her in the basement for weeks, feeding her just enough to keep her alive. It was during this time that her older brothers, Thomas and William, also began to treat her as a wife. 1030, the Blackwood case wasn't just about a wicked man, explains Dr. Rodriguez. It was about how extreme isolation can create microsocieties with their own rules, where behaviors that would be universally condemned become normalized within that small circle. If you are watching this story and feel a mixture of horror and compassion for the Blackwood family tragedy, leave a comment now. 1053, these mountains hold secrets that should never have existed. Your comment helps alert more people to these hidden realities we must collectively face. During the trial, genetics experts explained to the jury the devastating consequences of prolonged consanguinity. 1111, Dr. Richard Collins, one of the nation's first forensic genetics experts, presented evidence that Margaret's children suffered from multiple rare genetic conditions that occur at a much higher rate in families with a history of consanguinity. The odds of some of the conditions observed in these children occurring naturally are approximately 1 in 500,000, stated Dr. Collins. 1132, in families with a history of close consanguinity over multiple generations, these odds increase to 1 in 50. The behavior of the accused during the trial only intensified the public's shock. Joseph Blackwood remained impassive, refusing to acknowledge the severity of his actions. In a particularly disturbing moment, he told the judge, "No one has the right to interfere with how a man rules his family." 12 o'clock, Thomas and William, the older brothers, seemed genuinely confused as to why they were being tried. James, the youngest brother, was the only one who showed signs of remorse, crying during Margaret's testimony. The most frightening aspect of the Blackwood case, says forensic psychologist Dr. Rodriguez, is how absolute isolation allowed a completely distorted worldview to become the only reality for those children. 1226, Joseph's children grew up believing their actions were normal, even traditional. In a surprising development during the trial, old records came to light suggesting that Joseph himself was the product of a relationship between his father and his sister, a revelation that cast new light on the intergenerational cycle of consanguinity in the family. 1247, in extremely isolated communities, especially prior to the 1950s, it was not uncommon for patterns of consanguinity to be established and perpetuated over generations, explains cultural anthropologist Dr. Martha Stevens. These communities developed their own justifications, often mixing distorted interpretations of religious texts with oral traditions about the purity of family blood. 1315, the trial also exposed the failure of local authorities and social services. Although the Blackwood children had never attended school or received mandatory vaccinations, no investigation had ever been conducted. A local social work employee admitted the family had been on a checklist for years, but due to staff shortages and the difficulty of accessing the property, the case was never properly followed up. 1338, the sentence, pronounced in July 1979, was historic. Joseph Blackwood was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms with no possibility of parole. Thomas and William each received 45 years, while James, considered less culpable due to being under his father's influence, received a 20-year sentence. 1359, while the court case came to an end, the real battle for Margaret and her children was just beginning. Detailed medical examinations of the children revealed the devastating extent of the genetic consequences of prolonged consanguinity. Robert, then 6, had not only visible physical malformations but also serious heart problems that would require multiple surgeries throughout his life. 1425, his immune system was so compromised that common infections posed potentially fatal threats. Mary, age 4, suffered from a rare metabolic disease that affected her ability to process proteins, requiring an extremely restrictive diet. Her cognitive development was significantly delayed, and neurological exams indicated structural abnormalities in the brain. 1447, the Blackwood case provided the medical community a unique opportunity to study the extreme effects of close consanguinity over multiple generations, explains Dr. Lawrence Peterson, a geneticist who followed the case. The problems observed in these children went far beyond what we typically see in first-generation consanguinity cases. 1509, genetic analyses, still in their infancy at the time, confirmed that both children carried multiple recessive genetic mutations that only manifested because they had received identical copies of defective genes from both their maternal and paternal sides, precisely the scenario that makes consanguineous relationships so problematic genetically. 1530, in normal populations, many of us carry one or two potentially harmful recessive genetic mutations, explains Dr. Peterson. But since our partners likely don't carry the same mutations, our children inherit only one copy and remain healthy. In consanguineous relationships, especially when repeated over generations, the likelihood of a child inheriting two identical copies of a defective gene increases dramatically. 1558, Sarah, Margaret's younger sister, faced her own tragedy. Her pregnancy, the result of a forced relationship with her father, had severe complications. The baby, born prematurely in May 1979, lived only 2 days, suffering from multiple organ failures. Sarah's case represents the vicious cycle of consanguinity, says Dr. Rodriguez. 1620, she herself was already the product of a compromised genetic pool, and her child faced even greater genetic challenges. Legal intervention, as late as it was, at least interrupted this cycle. Margaret, Sarah, and the surviving children faced not only medical challenges but also social stigma. After the trial, the family was relocated to another state with new identities as part of a precursor program to what we now know as witness protection. 1651, the stigma associated with consanguinity is as old as civilization itself, explains anthropologist Dr. Richard Barnes. Virtually all cultures have developed taboos against close-kin relationships, partly out of intuition about genetic consequences, but also as a form of social organization. When extreme cases like the Blackwoods come to light, they often provoke visceral revulsion. 1714, the Blackwood case also had significant political and social repercussions. In 1980, the Virginia legislature revised its laws on child abuse and incest, creating harsher penalties and clearer procedures for intervention in suspected cases. Social services in various states strengthened their protocols for identifying and monitoring families in extreme isolation. 1738, before the Blackwood case, there was a cultural reluctance to interfere with how traditional families organized themselves, especially in remote rural areas, explained social historian Parker. This case helped establish that certain practices are unacceptable regardless of cultural context or geographical location. Researchers also began to study the isolated communities of Appalachia more systematically. 1803, they found that while the Blackwood case represented an extreme, marriages between first and second cousins were not uncommon in certain remote areas up until the 1960s. Geographic isolation, poverty, and distrust of outsiders created conditions for some communities to remain culturally segregated from the rest of society for generations, explains sociologist Dr. Michael Harris. 1830, in some of these social bubbles, practices that had been abandoned by the rest of society persisted well into the 20th century. The Blackwood story became a case study not only for geneticists but also for social workers, psychologists, sociologists, and legal professionals, illustrating the extreme consequences of social isolation and consanguinity. 1854, 4 to 7 years after the Blackwood case came to light, the echoes of that dark story still resonate, both in the lives of the survivors and in American public policy and collective consciousness. Margaret Blackwood, who assumed a new identity after the trial, lived a discreet life in the Midwest. According to limited reports, she managed to obtain a basic education and worked for many years as an assistant in a municipal library. 1920, she never remarried, dedicating her life to caring for her children. She died in 2017 at the age of 62 due to heart complications. Her son, Robert, faced numerous medical challenges throughout his life. He underwent 17 surgeries by adulthood, mostly to correct cardiac and orthopedic problems. Despite his physical and cognitive limitations, he achieved partial independence, working in sheltered employment and living in an assisted community. 1948, he gave an anonymous interview to a researcher in 2005, saying, "I never met my father or my uncles, and I'm grateful for that. The only family I ever needed was my mother." Mary, Margaret's daughter, had a more difficult path. Her neurological conditions severely limited her ability to develop independent living skills. 2011, she has lived in specialized institutions since adolescence and requires continuous care to this day. Sarah, Margaret's younger sister, may have achieved the most remarkable recovery. After years of intensive therapy, she completed high school and later college, becoming a social worker specializing in child abuse cases. 2033, in occasional lectures, always using a pseudonym and altered appearance, she shares her experience to train professionals working with abuse victims. Sarah's case represents the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit, says Dr. Rodriguez. Turning such profound trauma into motivation to help others is a healing path few can walk. 2054, Joseph Blackwood died in prison in 1992 at the age of 61, having never shown remorse for his actions. Thomas and William remain incarcerated, having had all their parole requests denied. James, who received the lighter sentence, was released in 1999 and lives under supervision in an undisclosed state, where he reportedly works as a mechanic and leads a solitary life. 2117, the site of the Blackwood property was completely abandoned. The cabin was demolished, and the area was gradually reclaimed by the forest. Few local residents can identify the exact spot where the family lived, and the more superstitious avoid the area, claiming it holds a heavy energy. There is a natural human tendency to want to erase the physical traces of tragedies like this, explains Dr. Barnes. 2143, it's as if by removing the visible evidence, we could somehow erase the stain on the community's collective conscience. The most lasting legacy of the Blackwood case, however, lies in the social and legal changes it triggered. Stricter child abuse laws, increased resources for protection services in rural areas, and enhanced protocols for monitoring families in extreme isolation were implemented in several states. 2208, the Blackwood case represents a turning point in how American society views its collective responsibility to protect children, says retired Judge Martha Collins, who oversaw several child abuse cases during her career. It forced us to recognize that even in a society that values family privacy, there are limits that cannot be crossed. 2230, from a scientific standpoint, the case provided valuable insights into the effects of prolonged consanguinity on the human genome. DNA samples collected from all family members were preserved, and with the advancement of genetic sequencing technologies in subsequent decades, they continue to yield new information about the involved genetic mechanisms. 2253, the Blackwood samples, as they're known in the scientific community, represent a unique record of the extreme effects of multigenerational consanguinity, explains Dr. Peterson. Every advance in genomic technology allows us to extract new information from these samples, contributing to our understanding of rare genetic diseases. Perhaps the most important legacy of the case is educational. 2317, the Blackwood story is studied in medical, law, social work, and psychology schools as an extreme example of the consequences of social isolation and consanguinity. The value of this story lies in its power to warn about early warning signs, explains Dr. Stevens. No family reaches this extreme point overnight. 2338, there is always a gradual process of isolation, control, and normalization of abusive behaviors that, if identified early, can be interrupted. For the rural communities of Appalachia, the case brought often unwanted scrutiny. Many residents of these areas were unfairly stigmatized, as if the Blackwoods' extreme behavior was representative of their culture. 2400 hours 02, it's important to distinguish between the natural geographical isolation of these communities and the pathological isolation imposed by individuals like Joseph Blackwood, emphasizes Dr. Harris. The vast majority of families living in remote areas maintain healthy connections with neighboring communities and adhere to fundamental social norms. 2400 hours 23, if you've watched this far, it's because this story resonated with you. Leave a comment saying I watched here so I can get to know you and see who truly appreciates the stories here on the channel. Don't forget to like this video so more people can learn about these stories that need to be told, and share it with someone you believe should understand the dangers of extreme isolation and consanguinity. 2400 Hours 45. Subscribe to the channel to follow more real cases that reveal obscure aspects of human nature and help us protect the most vulnerable. The story of the Blackwoods remains a dark reminder of how extreme isolation, combined with cultural distortions and individual pathology, can create environments where the unthinkable becomes reality. 25:07. It is also a story of human resilience, demonstrating how even victims of the most terrible circumstances can, with proper support, rebuild their lives. In words attributed to Sarah Blackwood during one of her rare public appearances, "What happened in Pine Hollow was not our choice. But what we do with this experience now is." Every time a child is rescued from an abusive situation because someone recognized the warning signs, our story takes on a new meaning. 25:36. As the Appalachian Mountains continue to hold their secrets, the Blackwood case stands as a reminder of our collective responsibility to protect the most vulnerable, especially when they are hidden from society's view.